Have you ever wondered why the United States can print money endlessly without collapsing its economy? Or why, when oil prices rise, the price of everything from a loaf of bread to a bus ticket seems to rise along with it, as if cursed? Or why the dollar appears everywhere, from markets in Lagos to ports in Shanghai to the gas pump on the corner of your street, even though nobody ever voted to make it the world's money? 3 questions, 1 answer, and that answer has a name that sounds incredibly powerful: the petrodollar. This global monetary system came from a secret handshake between the United States and Saudi Arabia, carried out quietly in 1974, with no press conference, no live stream on social media, and almost nobody teaching you about it in school. But that handshake reshaped the entire world you live in today, from the gasoline prices you paid this morning, to the reasons wars erupt in the Middle East, to why some nations become wealthy, while others spend decades struggling to catch up. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to explain all of it. Part 1, the background. The world before the petrodollar was born. Let's rewind time to the 1970s. The United States was facing a headache in the most literal sense possible. The Vietnam War had dragged on for nearly 2 decades, and every additional day of fighting meant another piece of the federal budget evaporating. Inflation was rising rapidly. Prices were climbing everywhere. People were protesting in the streets. And Nixon, the president, whom the world would later mostly remember for the Watergate scandal, the incident where he secretly wiretapped political opponents and then denied everything was sitting in the White House, facing a problem even bigger than that scandal. The dollar itself was beginning to shake. But to understand why the dollar was shaking, we need to go back even further, all the way to 1944. The Second World War was nearing its end. Europe was in ruins, and the great powers needed to sit down together and redesign the global financial system from scratch. They chose a resort town called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a name that sounds relaxing. But the decisions made there would affect the entire planet for decades afterward. The new rules were simple. The United States dollar would become the center of the global financial system. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. And the dollar itself would be pegged to gold, $35 for 1 ounce of gold, fixed permanently. It sounded extremely stable, extremely trustworthy, extremely responsible, at least in theory. In reality, the United States began doing something that any responsible adult knows should never be done: spending more than it actually had. Spending on the Korean War, spending on the Vietnam War, spending on the space program, social welfare, and every other ambition of a superpower determined to prove itself. And every time more money was needed, the simplest solution was print more. The problem was this: the gold in the vaults did not multiply on its own. It was like having a bank account with $10 million, but writing checks as if you had 50 million. The first month feels fine. The second month, nobody notices yet. But eventually, people begin bringing those checks to the bank to cash them. And that is when everything falls apart. And that is exactly what happened. European countries led by France, whose president Charles de Gaulle was famously distrustful of the United States, began following the rules exactly as written, bringing dollars to America and demanding gold in exchange, just as promised, not because they particularly loved gold, but because they had realized that the United States was printing more money than its actual reserves could support. The gold reserves at Fort Knox began shrinking, fast enough to become alarming. Nixon looked at the gold reserves, looked at the piles of dollars being brought in for conversion, and made a decision that was technically rational, but financially and morally remains controversial to this day. On August 15th, 1971, Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would close the gold window, meaning that from that moment onward, nobody would be allowed to exchange dollars for gold anymore. The Bretton Woods commitment, the foundation of the global economy for 27 years, was erased in a single speech. The financial world almost exploded. From that point forward, the dollar became a currency, no longer backed by anything tangible, no gold, no silver, nothing at all. Only trust remained. And the great question at that moment was trust in what that is exactly the question Kissinger would answer with a flight into the deserts of Saudi Arabia. Part 2. The historic handshake between the United States and Saudi Arabia. So, what did the United States do after the dollar lost its foundation in gold? It found a new foundation. And what it chose so clever, it was almost cunning, was not gold, not silver, but oil. In 1974, Henry Kissinger, the United States Secretary of State, famous for never doing anything without calculation, flew to Saudi Arabia not for tourism, not to eat falafel sandwiches, but to place a deal on the table that Saudi Arabia could hardly refuse. The deal itself was simple. Saudi Arabia would agree to sell oil only in United States dollars, not French francs, not British pounds, not anything else. In return, the United States would protect Saudi Arabia militarily, essentially acting as the bodyguard of the entire kingdom, and help the Saudis invest their enormous oil wealth into United States government bonds. Saudi Arabia agreed. And from that moment, the gears began turning. The consequences were enormously beneficial for the United States. If you wanted to buy oil, something nearly every economy on earth needed, you first had to obtain dollars. And if you wanted dollars, you had to earn them from or buy them through the United States, which meant the entire world, whether it liked it or not, was forced to hold dollars. Imagine it like this. You open the best pizza shop in town. Customers line up around the block, but the shop accepts payment only in a special currency, a currency that only you are allowed to print. Want pizza? First, you need to buy my money. Genius, maybe. Shameless, maybe that too. But effective, impossible to deny. Part 3. How the petrodollar system works. So, how does this system actually work? It is so simple that it almost makes you angry for not thinking of it first. Let's follow the flow of money in one full circle. Japan needs oil to run its factories. To buy oil from Saudi Arabia, it has to pay in dollars. There is no other option. So Japan goes out and buys dollars. Saudi Arabia sells oil and receives an enormous pile of dollars. But instead of letting those dollars sit idle in storage, the Saudis use them to buy United States government bonds, which basically means lending the money right back to the United States. The United States receives the money, gains more budget to spend, and if it needs more, it can simply print more dollars. Then the cycle begins again, and the wheel keeps spinning forever. This cycle has an official name, petrodollar recycling, which sounds like a state recycling program. But in reality, it is the recycling of power on a global scale. And the benefits the United States receives from this system are enormous because the entire world needs to hold dollars. Huge quantities of dollars are absorbed outside the United States, meaning that even if America prints more money, domestic inflation does not immediately explode. The United States can borrow money at extremely low interest rates because everyone wants to buy American government bonds, and budget deficits, not a major problem. Just issue more bonds, and somebody will buy them. To put it bluntly, the United States is playing a game where it wrote the rules, owns the stadium, and prints the money being used inside it. And the rest of the world still playing along because there are no real alternatives. Part 4. How the Petrodollar changed the world. Alright, that handshake in 1974 was not just an economic agreement. It was the first domino, and when it fell, the entire world shook with it. The first consequence. The Middle East suddenly became America's backyard. Once oil and the dollar became tightly linked, any instability in the Middle East directly threatened the global financial system. The United States could not afford to sit still. It had to be there through military bases, alliance, and support for democracy in many different forms. And here is an interesting detail. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. Was it because of weapons of mass destruction? Officially, yes. But the timing is certainly strange, because one of the first things done after the invasion was returning Iraqi oil sales back to dollar payments. No further comment. The second consequence. The United States gained a privilege no other country possesses. Most countries, if they print too much money, are punished immediately by inflation. The currency loses value. Prices rise. People protest. But the United States is different because dollars are absorbed across the entire world. America can run deficits worth trillions without being punished immediately. Economists call this the exorbitant privilege. Put bluntly, the United States is playing under a set of rules that only it is allowed to use. The third consequence, poorer countries became trapped inside an extremely sophisticated system. Want to buy oil? You need dollars. Want dollars? Then export goods, usually raw materials or cheap labor, to wealthier countries. Want development loans? Borrow from the IMF or the World Bank, also in dollars and with conditions attached. This cycle was not accidental, whether intentional or not. It was structured in a way that kept developing nations permanently chasing behind. The fourth consequence, oil prices became the heartbeat of the global economy. In 1973, Arab countries cut oil exports to the United States. Oil prices quadrupled within months, and the entire Western world fell into recession. In 2008, oil prices surged to record highs and then collapsed, helping trigger the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. In 2022, the war in Ukraine caused oil prices to spike again, and global inflation exploded. Along with them, every time oil sneezes, the world economy catches a cold. That is not a metaphor, it is reality. Part 5 is the petrodollar dying. The world is changing. More than 50 years of dominance. And now, for the first time, the system is beginning to shake, not collapsing, not exploding, but cracking slowly. In many places at once, China is trying to persuade Saudi Arabia to experiment with selling oil in yuan. Saudi Arabia, America's closest partner for the last 50 years, is listening. Russia, after being cut off from the Western financial system, shifted to selling oil to India in rupees. India agreed because the oil was cheaper. Russia agreed because it had few alternatives left. And BRICS, the bloc made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and an increasing number of new members, is seriously discussing a shared currency to reduce dependence on the dollar. This wave is called de-dollarization. And if you are an official inside the United States Treasury Department, this is the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night. But, and this is the important but, the dollar still makes up around 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. Most international oil contracts are still priced in dollars. The global banking system still runs on a dollar-based foundation. No existing currency is strong enough to replace it immediately. The yuan is still not freely convertible. Europe has its own problems with the euro. And BRICS is still spending more time discussing than implementing. The dollar is not dead, but it is no longer untouchable the way it once was. To put it simply, the dollar is still the kingpin of the neighborhood, but for the first time in 50 years, some people are beginning to look the kingpin directly in the eyes without lowering their heads. So now you have completed the full circle from a desert in Saudi Arabia, a handshake in 1974, and a man named Kissinger, whose geopolitical mind never seemed to rest the United States, managed to build something no empire in history had ever truly achieved: global financial dominance without conquering territory directly. Militarily, perhaps not. Economically, well, we just finished watching it happen. The petrodollar is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a topic reserved for obscure internet forums at 2 in the morning. It is real history, thoroughly documented, affecting every economy on this planet, including your wallet, the next time you stop at a gas station. Look at the numbers on the price board and let out a sigh. Remember that number is not random. It is the result of 50 years of geopolitics, handshakes in the desert, and a system carefully designed to operate exactly the way you have just seen. You are not simply buying gasoline. You are participating in the largest power system in the world, whether you want to or not. If this video helped you understand even a little more about the world operating around you, hit like, subscribe, and more importantly, share it with that friend who always complains, "Why is gasoline so expensive?" Now, you have the answer. And the answer is much longer than they probably imagined